When I got back to my office, it felt different. It always did after a meeting like that. You can sense it, that shift in the air. Like the company had already started to move on without me. But I was still physically sitting at my desk, doing my job. My office wasn't much to look at, just the usual cramped space, filled with filing cabinets and maps of construction sites. The kind of place that gets smaller over the years, even though nothing in it changes. But it was my space, and it had been for almost as long as I'd been at Driftline. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, the one I rarely ever opened unless I needed something specific. In it was a thick blue folder. I'd kept it for 8 years, not because I knew exactly when I'd need it, but because I knew that at some point I might need a backup plan. Every corner cut, every inspection rushed, every time we used a material that wasn't quite up to spec, but nobody said anything because the deadline was tight. It was all documented, dated, and annotated in my neat block handwriting. I wasn't the one who made those decisions. I fought against them every time. But when you work in this business long enough, you learn that the decisions made from the high-rise offices often don't consider the realities on the ground. When deadlines come at you like a freight train, you don't always have the luxury of playing by the book. I'd kept the folder for years, quietly, as insurance. It wasn't out of spite. It was for the day when someone above me made a catastrophic decision. And when that day came, I wanted to be able to prove that I didn't let it happen without raising my voice, even if my objections were mostly ignored. I closed the drawer without taking the folder out. Not yet, I thought. Maybe it wouldn't come to that. Maybe the company would listen, or maybe they'd change direction. But as I glanced out of the window, I saw Jordan Blake shaking hands with a younger man in an expensive suit. They were laughing, glancing over at my office. That's when I knew this wasn't just about some restructuring. This wasn't about improving efficiency or modernizing. This was about moving on from people like me. The ones who had put in the hours, the ones who knew every inch of the company and how it worked. I was the guy who had spent 3 decades in the trenches, making sure things didn't fall apart. But the guys who sat in the boardrooms, looking at their screens, didn't understand that they thought they could replace people like me with new systems, with fancy technology, and slick MBS. They were wrong. I'd spent 30 years at Driftline Construction, and for most of that time, it felt like I was in a permanent seat at the conference table, always part of the plan. I mean, not the same room, but the same job, field operations manager. The guy who made sure Driftline built things that didn't fall down. The guy who kept the crew on track, the timelines in check, and the materials up to spec. My name's Howard Ames. I'm 61 years old. I've spent the last 20 years overseeing every major commercial project in Columbus, Ohio. I've seen a lot in those years. Good days, hard days, and a whole lot of in between. And no, I'm not just some old guy holding on to the past. I've built things that stand today because I followed the blueprint to the letter. I was the guy who ensured every inspection was passed, every permit was cleared, and every safety measure was adhered to. But things were changing, and not in the way I liked. Jordan Blake, our new Chief Operating Officer, was the poster child for the new wave of leadership. He came from a tech company in California, and to him, my 30 years of hands-on experience with concrete, steel, and city codes was an outdated manual. He had a slick MBA and a shiny new tablet to prove it. He wasn't here for old methods. His first big move, restructuring. The kind of restructuring that meant getting rid of the old guard. That meant me. We need someone with fresh ideas for this division. Someone who understands modern efficiency, he'd said, without even looking up from his tablet. The board wants a restructuring plan by next quarter. In my head, I already knew what was coming. It was a familiar feeling, a feeling of being irrelevant, of being phased out. You get to a point where you don't need to hear the words. You know the shift has already happened. The fact that Jordan didn't make eye contact during the meeting, scrolling through his tablet as he talked, told me everything I needed to know. He continued, "We need to cut overhead and streamline the old processes." And I replied, calm and measured, "The old processes, the ones that kept our building standing and our permits in order." I didn't argue. I didn't fight him. I just nodded and said, "I understand. That's how it goes, right? The corporate world moves on, and the people who put in the hard work, who built the foundation of a company, get left behind. I've had enough experience to know that fighting the tide only leaves you exhausted and bruised. So, I didn't fight. I understood." The meeting ended quickly, without much fanfare. Nothing was really decided, but everything was understood. I was a relic of a bygone era, a resource to be phased out. The following morning, I sat in my truck across from the Riverside Plaza site, watching the action unfold. Gloria arrived first, with 3 additional inspectors and a city attorney in tow. I could see Jordan, already tense, pacing near the construction trailer. His face was a mix of frustration and confusion, the kind of look someone gets when they realize the game they've been playing is about to end. I watched as the inspectors began their work, methodically documenting every deviation from the approved plans. By noon, the site was a quiet, chaotic mess. Workers stood in groups, unsure what to do next. As Gloria and her team worked through the paperwork, taking photos, and marking down every violation, my phone buzzed with a text from Louise, the site foreman. He'd been with Driftline for years, and I knew he was caught in the middle of something that wasn't his fault. "What the hell did you do?" he texted. I didn't respond. There was no need. This wasn't personal. It wasn't about revenge. It was about doing the job right, something Driftline had forgotten to do over the years. This was about ensuring that every building, every structure, was safe for the people who would work and live in them. 2 weeks passed before I heard anything more from Driftline. Gloria and I had spoken briefly, but there was no sign of the company's leadership trying to make things right. Instead, the silence was deafening. I spent the time sorting through my personal files at home, organizing what remained of my career after Driftline had let me go. My severance check had arrived, but it was much less than I'd been promised when prorated over 6 months. It didn't matter much, though I wasn't in it for the money anymore. I was in it for justice. Then, on a Tuesday morning, my phone rang. "Howard, I hope you're doing well." Jordan's voice sounded overly casual. It grated on me. He was trying to keep things professional, but there was no masking his desperation. "Listen, we're having some issues with the Riverside Plaza project, and I was hoping you might consult for a day or 2. I was surprised, but not shocked. The Riverside Plaza project was the biggest one Driftline had on their plate, and things were falling apart. Gloria had been right. The issues were bigger than they realized, and they were quickly spiraling out of control. "What kind of issues?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "Just some permit questions," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "The city inspector is making a fuss about some modified plans that weren't resubmitted. Nothing major, but it's holding things up." I knew exactly where this was going. They were trying to fix their mistakes by bending the rules, and they wanted me to help them do it. I'd seen this all before, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. "I'd be happy to help," I said, knowing exactly how I was going to play this. "But my consulting rate is $300 an hour." with a 2-day minimum retainer up front. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could practically hear him calculating in his head. "That's steep, Howard," he finally said. "We were thinking more along the lines of your previous salary equivalent." "Let me make this clear," I replied, my tone firm. "That was an employee rate. I'm a consultant now, and consultants with my specific knowledge don't come cheap." There was another pause. I could tell that Jordan was caught off guard, but I wasn't going to back down. "Not this time. I'll talk to Thomas and get back to you," he finally said. I didn't expect them to accept so quickly, but they called back that same day. This time, Thomas himself was on the line, agreeing to my terms but making it clear that this was a one-time arrangement. I signed their hastily prepared contract and agreed to meet with the project manager the next morning at Riverside. When I arrived, I could see the problem immediately. The foundation footprint had been expanded beyond the approved plans, encroaching into the setback zone by nearly 6 feet. I'd seen this before Driftline was trying to increase the square footage of the retail space without going through the proper channels. It was the same old story. Ask for forgiveness, not permission. Jordan was already there, standing next to Alan Pierce, the project manager. He looked tense, his eyes darting from one side to the other as he tried to catch my attention. "Howard, thanks for coming," Jordan said, trying to keep his voice light. "We've got a situation with Inspector Daniels. She's claiming we violated the setback requirements and is threatening to issue a stop work order." I looked at him and then at Alan. "Have you violated the setbacks?" I asked bluntly. Alan shifted uncomfortably. The approved plans had a 40-foot setback. We modified it to 34 feet, based on market demand for larger retail footprints. And we submitted revised plans, but they're still in process. Jordan cut in. "But we needed to keep the project moving. Surely you understand how these things work, Howard?" I didn't flinch. "No, I don't. You've violated the setbacks, and you want me to help you cover it up?" Jordan's face darkened, but I could tell he knew I was right. I wasn't going to sugarcoat it for him. "We were hoping you could talk to Inspector Daniels," he said, his voice almost pleading. "She's always respected you." I sighed. This was at the point of no return. "I see," I said. "You want me to use my relationship with Gloria to convince her to overlook these violations so you can keep working?" Jordan nodded, hopeful, essentially. "Yes," he said, as if it was no big deal. "It's just bureaucratic red tape. The modifications are minor." I walked the site, checking measurements and making notes. The violations weren't minor. They affected drainage, emergency access, routes, and utility hookups. I wasn't going to let them sweep this under the rug. "I'll speak with Gloria," I said, finally breaking the silence. "But I need copies of everything. Original plans, modified plans, permit applications, approval letters, everything." They handed over the files without hesitation. They were desperate for me to fix their mess, but I wasn't about to make their problems disappear. This wasn't about saving their project, it was about doing the right thing. I had started at Driftline when Frank Dre still ran things. He was the founder, and he had a saying that stuck with me through the years. "Every shortcut shows up eventually." Howard, those words had become my guiding principle, the backbone of my career. Frank had built this company from the ground up, turning it from a small residential contractor into one of the biggest commercial developers in Central Ohio. But more than the business side of things, Frank cared about one thing above all else: the people. He taught me that buildings weren't just about steel and concrete. They were about the lives that depended on them, the workers, the tenants, the communities. He taught me that shortcuts may save time or money in the short run, but sooner or later, gravity and water always collect their debts. His lessons were grounded in integrity, in doing things the right way, no matter how hard it got. I became known as the Blueprint Man, the guy who followed plans to the letter, who knew every building code by heart. My crews trusted me because I was the one who could spot a problem before the first shovel hit the dirt. I wasn't just making sure the building didn't fall down. I was protecting the integrity of the work, ensuring that every inch of the structure was built according to the plan. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. And I took a great deal of pride in that responsibility. But as the years went on, Driftline started changing. Frank retired, and Thomas Dre, his son, took over in 2010. Thomas was ambitious, driven. He wanted to make Driftline bigger, to compete with the national firms, and to push the company into a new era of growth. I respected his vision, but his methods worried me. He was impatient, and he believed that the company's success depended on how quickly we could move, how aggressively we could bend the rules without breaking them. I remember the first time we started foundation work without final permit approval. It felt wrong. I raised hell about it, but Thomas just pulled me aside and said, "Howard, you're valuable to this company, but things have changed. Sometimes we need to start early to meet deadlines. The permits always come through eventually." He was right about that last part. The permits did always come through eventually. Because I had relationships with every inspector and zoning official in the county. I had earned their trust over the years. They believed me when I said any issues would be fixed. They knew I would always make it right. But that's when I started the Blue Folder. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I needed to protect myself in case something went wrong. So, I documented everything. Every corner cut, every inspection rushed, every shortcut that was taken. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't challenge the decisions, but I made sure I had a record, just in case. Over the years, my objections became quieter. I still raised concerns, but I argued less and documented more. I became known as the old-school guy, reliable, but behind the times. Meanwhile, I watched as young project managers got promoted based on how quickly they could get a job done, not how well it was built. I watched as Thomas moved more aggressive people into leadership roles. People who were willing to bend the rules if it meant hitting the numbers. And then came Jordan Blake. I'd met him for the first time just 5 months ago, a 35-year MBA, fresh out of California, with no construction experience. He was introduced as the future of Driftline's operations strategy. I shook his hand and immediately knew that the slow fracture I had been witnessing over the years had finally reached my office door. The world I had known at Driftline was coming to an end. Jordan looked at me like I was obsolete, like I was just another cog in the machine, slowing them down. He came in with his shiny new ideas, his new systems, and a plan to streamline things. He didn't understand the foundation that Driftline was built on. He didn't understand the value of doing things right. All he saw was inefficiency. The day we met for the restructuring discussion, I knew what was coming. There was no real conversation. There was no negotiation. It was just a notification. They were phasing me out. 30 years of institutional knowledge, of experience and dedication, reduced to overhead. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even upset. I had seen it coming for a while. The meeting ended with nothing decided, but everything understood. And when I got back to my office, I opened that bottom drawer and looked at the blue folder again. It was still there, tucked away, but now it seemed even more important. I had kept it for years, hoping it wouldn't come to this, but now I knew it might. And as I sat in my office, watching Jordan and his new cohort laugh in the hallway, I knew what I had to do. Driftline had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. By noon, I was sitting in my truck in the Driftline parking lot, the engine off, my hands resting on the steering wheel. The sky was clear, and I could see the skyline of downtown Columbus in the distance. 6 buildings I had helped build, standing tall and proud against the backdrop of the clouds. I had given 30 years of my life to this company. I had poured my heart and soul into every project, missing weekends and holidays, losing personal time, sacrificing everything to ensure that Driftline succeeded. And now, here I was, sitting in the parking lot, a folder full of records in my bag, and the company I had helped build was treating me like I was obsolete. It didn't sit well with me, but I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt something different, something colder, more calculated. It wasn't personal anymore. It was about doing what was right, about ensuring that the buildings I helped create were built properly, with integrity. I had spent decades making sure that buildings didn't just stand, they stood safely, securely, and Driftline, under its new leadership, had lost sight of that. They were cutting corners. They were taking shortcuts. They were sacrificing safety and compliance for the sake of speed and cost. And it was only a matter of time before those shortcuts came back to haunt them. As I sat in the truck, I could feel the weight of what I needed to do settling over me. I wasn't just going to walk away from this. Not after everything I'd given. Not after everything I had built. No, this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the work. This was about making sure that Driftline didn't get away with compromising safety and cutting corners at the expense of the people who would one day work and live in the buildings we were constructing. I had built too much, had invested too much, to let it fall apart now. I started the truck and drove downtown to the Office of Building Safety. The city inspector, Gloria Daniels, had been a junior inspector when I first met her 25 years ago. She had worked her way up the ranks, and now she was the department head. We had worked together for years, and she knew exactly what Driftline was capable of. She had seen firsthand the kind of pressure Thomas had put on the department to overlook violations. She knew the lengths Driftline had gone to in order to skirt building codes. But Gloria was a professional, and she took her job seriously. I knew that if I showed her the evidence I had, she would understand the scope of the problem. When I walked into her office, she looked up in surprise. "Howard," she said, clearly not expecting me, "what brings you by?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Problem with one of the sites," I said. "Not anymore," I added, my voice steady. "I've been let go. Driftline fired me." Her eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "Driftline fired you? Are they insane?" I shrugged. "They're restructuring. Well, their loss," she said. "You want to grab coffee, catch up?" I placed the blue folder on her desk. "Actually, I think you should read this first." For the next few weeks, I stayed in touch with Gloria. I didn't hear anything from Driftline, and I wasn't sure what to expect. But the calls from old colleagues started coming in, expressing shock at my departure. It seemed like no one had expected it, least of all me. Driftline had always been my home. But that day had marked a turning point. I had to move on. I had to do something bigger. Then, one Tuesday morning, my phone rang. It was Jordan Blake. "Howard," he said, his voice overly casual. "I hope you're doing well. Listen, we're having some issues with the Riverside Plaza project, and I was hoping you might consult for a day or two." Riverside Plaza was the biggest project in Driftline's pipeline, A multi-use development that was going to change the skyline of Columbus. Ground had broken 3 months ago, and it was a major undertaking. "What kind of issues?" I asked, my voice steady. "Just some permit questions," he said. "The city inspector is making a fuss about modified plans that weren't resubmitted. Nothing major, but it's holding things up." I already knew who the inspector was, Gloria, and I knew exactly what was happening. Driftline was trying to circumvent the rules again, hoping I could use my connections to make it go away. "I'd be happy to help," I said, my voice calm. "Consulting rate is $300 an hour, with a 2-day minimum retainer up front." Silence on the line. "That's steep, Howard," he said after a pause. "We were thinking more along the lines of your previous salary equivalent." "That was an employee rate," I replied. "I'm a consultant now. An experienced consultants with my specific knowledge don't come cheap." There was more silence. "Let me talk to Thomas and get back to you." Later that day, they called back. Thomas himself had agreed to my terms, but he made it clear that this was a one-time arrangement. They needed me, but only for this project. I signed their hastily prepared contract, and agreed to meet the project manager at the Riverside site the next morning. The following morning, I arrived at the Riverside Plaza site, ready to assess the situation. As I stepped out of my truck, I noticed Jordan pacing near the construction trailer, his face tight with concern. Alan Pierce, the project manager, was standing next to him, looking uneasy. As I approached, Jordan gave me a tight smile and said, "Howard, thanks for coming. We've got a situation with Inspector Daniels." "Situation?" I asked, already suspecting what was going on. "Yeah, she's claiming we violated the setback requirements," Jordan continued. "She's threatening to issue a stop work order unless we make some changes. The thing is, we modified the foundation plan to meet market demand, and now it's causing issues." I raised an eyebrow. "Have you violated the setbacks?" I asked, probing for the truth. Alan shifted on his feet, uncomfortable with the question. "Well, the approved plans had a 40-foot setback," he said. "But we modified it to 34 feet to give the retail space a larger footprint. The revised plans are in process, but the inspector isn't having it." Jordan jumped in, clearly agitated. "But we needed to keep the project moving. Surely, you understand how these things work, Howard? We were hoping you could talk to Inspector Daniels, explain the situation to her. You know she respects you." I stood there, arms crossed, absorbing the information. The story was familiar to me. Driftline had been cutting corners for years. This wasn't the first time they'd modified plans to increase space without proper authorization, but this time, they were hoping to use me to cover up their mistake. I wasn't surprised. This kind of thing had been going on for too long. And now it was affecting a project that was supposed to be their flagship. I nodded slowly, taking it all in. "I see," I said. "You want me to use my relationship with Gloria to convince her to look the other way while you fix the paperwork, right?" Jordan didn't hesitate. "Essentially, yes," he admitted. "It's just bureaucratic red tape, Howard. The modification is minor, and the inspector's holding things up. We just need your help to smooth things over." I looked over the site, walking slowly across the foundation, taking measurements and noting the modifications. When I finished walking the site, I turned to face Jordan. "This isn't a minor issue," I said, my voice steady. "The modifications affect drainage calculations, emergency access routes, and utility hookups. These aren't small changes. You can't just brush them off." Jordan's face darkened, frustration creeping into his tone. "So, what's the solution here? Can we continue the work while we process the revised plans?" I maintained eye contact, my expression unwavering. "No, the modifications are substantial enough that they require a full review. You'll need to pause work on the affected areas until approval comes through," I said, my tone firm. "You brought me in for my expertise, and that's what I'm giving you. I've done exactly what my contract specified, consulting on permit issues." Jordan's face twisted in frustration, and I could see him processing the information. He was angry, but he knew there was no way around it. This wasn't a simple fix. This wasn't something that could be smoothed over with a handshake or a promise of future deals. The work needed to stop, and it needed to be reviewed thoroughly. He stormed off to make a phone call to Thomas. No doubt to report that things weren't going as smoothly as they had hoped. I used the opportunity to speak with the site foreman, Luis, a man I had known for 15 years. He was one of the few people still on the job who understood the importance of doing things right. "Listen, Luis," I said quietly, leaning in so no one else could hear. "They've got you building outside the permits. If the inspectors catch wind of this, it's going to shut the site down for weeks." Luis shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around. "Orders from above," he muttered. "They said the revised permits are coming, but they're not here yet, and more inspectors will be visiting soon." I nodded, knowing what had to be done. "Make sure everything that is being built matches exactly what's on the approved plans. Nothing more, nothing less," I said. "If you cut any corners, it's going to come back to haunt you. Trust me." Luis looked at me with understanding. He had been around long enough to know the consequences of cutting corners. He knew what would happen if Driftline's shortcuts were exposed. That afternoon, I received a phone call from Thomas, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Jordan tells me you've decided not to help us with the Riverside situation," he said. "I helped exactly as contracted," I replied, my tone calm. "I provided expert consultation on the permit issues. I'm not here to circumvent building codes and permit requirements. That was never my job at Driftline, and it's certainly not my job as a consultant." There was a long pause on the line, and I could feel the tension in Thomas's words when he finally spoke again. "You've always been a valued part of Driftline, Howard. That's why we offered you such a generous severance. But if you're working against Driftline's interests now, we'll need to reconsider our arrangement." The threat was clear: back off, or lose the severance. "Do what you feel is necessary, Thomas," I said, my voice steady. "I'll be doing the same." I hung up the phone and immediately called Gloria. "It's happening," I said. "Thomas just threatened to cancel my severance." "We're ready," she replied. "Inspection teams are being assembled. We'll start tomorrow with Riverside, then hit the other sites throughout the week. They'll try to clean things up once they realize what's happening, but we're moving fast." I hung up the phone and sat back in my chair, the weight of the situation settling over me. This wasn't personal. This was about doing things the right way. Driftline had taken shortcuts for too long, and now it was time for someone to hold them accountable. And I was the one who was going to do it. The following day, the Riverside site was already buzzing with activity when I arrived. It felt different. There was a sense of urgency that wasn't there before. Jordan was pacing back and forth near the construction trailer, his phone glued to his ear. Alan Pierce, the project manager, stood off to the side, his body language stiff with unease. It was clear they were under pressure, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction in that dot. As I approached, Jordan hung up the phone and gave me a tight smile. "Howard, thanks for coming," he said, though I could see the frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "We've got a situation with Inspector Daniels. She's claiming we violated the setback requirements, and she's threatening a stop work order. I raised an eyebrow, not surprised in the least. Have you violated the setbacks? I asked, cutting to the chase. Alan shifted awkwardly, avoiding my gaze. Well, the approved plans called for a 40-foot setback, he said, but we modified it to 34 feet in order to give the retail space a larger footprint. We're just waiting on the revised plans to go through. Jordan quickly added, but we needed to keep the project moving. Howard, you understand how these things work, right? I didn't hesitate. No, I don't. You've violated the setbacks, and you're asking me to cover for you. Jordan's face flushed with irritation. We were hoping you could talk to Inspector Daniels, explain the situation. She's always respected you, he said, his voice laced with desperation. I stood there for a moment, allowing the weight of the situation to sink in. This wasn't just about a minor violation or a simple bureaucratic issue. This was another attempt to manipulate the system, to bend the rules in favor of the company's growth agenda, without regard for the consequences. And once again, they wanted me to be complicit in their schemes. Tell me something, Jordan, I said, my tone firm. Do you really think that because of my relationship with Gloria, I'll just overlook these violations and help you sweep them under the rug? I'm not that kind of guy. You hired me for my expertise, and I'm giving it to you. But what you're asking me to do is wrong. Jordan opened his mouth to respond, but stopped short. He knew I was right. I continued, these aren't small changes. The setbacks affect drainage, emergency access, and utilities. These are critical issues. You can't just fix them with a quick phone call or a signature. His expression shifted from frustration to resignation. He knew I wasn't going to give him the easy way out. So, what do you suggest we do? He asked, his voice quiet. I suggest you pause work on the affected areas until you get the revised plans approved, I said. And I need to see everything: original plans, modified plans, permit applications, approval letters. You want me to help you? Then I need all the details. They reluctantly handed over the files, clearly eager for me to fix their mess. I wasn't sure how much good it would do, but I was determined to give them the correct advice. Once I had everything, I called Gloria. You've been busy, she said when she answered. I take it they're asking for your help. They're asking me to cover for them, I replied, my voice steady. But I won't do it. I'll help them, but I'm not going to help them break the rules. We need to understand exactly what they've changed, when they changed it, and if this is happening on other sites. Gloria's voice was calm but resolute. I figured as much. We've been tracking their work for a while now. I'll meet you at the coffee shop. Bring the files. We agreed to meet at a small cafe far from both Driftline's offices and the Riverside site. As I sat down across from Gloria, I noticed the tiredness in her eyes. She'd been through a lot, dealing with Driftline's pressure and manipulation over the years. But today, it felt like we were on the same side. Today, we were going to take action. I've been pulling Driftline's permit applications from the past 5 years, Gloria said, sliding a folder across the table. After looking through your documentation, it's clear there's a pattern. They've been systematically violating building codes, changing plans after approval, and substituting materials in ways that compromise safety. I opened the folder and scanned the photos from 8 different construction sites. The violations were undeniable. There were extra square footage, modified structural elements, and even instances where cheaper materials were used in place of the specified ones. It was clear that Driftline had been cutting corners, and it wasn't just a one-off mistake. It was a deliberate strategy built into their operations. How long has this been going on? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. For years, Gloria said, shaking her head. I've seen it, but I've never had the documentation to prove it. That's why we're moving quickly now. We've got enough evidence to make a real impact. I looked down at the pile of documents in front of me. It wasn't just about one project anymore. This was about everything Driftline had been doing to undermine the integrity of their operations. I knew what we had to do. We need to move fast, I said, looking up at Gloria. We can't let them fix this on their own terms. We need a full inspection of every active site. Gloria nodded, already making her own plans. I'll gather the inspection teams. We'll start with Riverside, then hit the other sites throughout the week. They'll try to clean things up once they realize what's happening, but we'll be prepared. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. This was it. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Driftline thought they could discard me and continue their shady practices without anyone noticing. But they were wrong. I wasn't going to let them get away with it